Hello everyone, my name is Lindsay Plater. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, working with Dr. Nassim Al-Idrous. If you're interested in a preprint of this work, you can find it on the Open Science Framework, just here. So picture this. You've just finished your shopping and you're looking for your white car. Your license plate starts with the letter N, so you're scanning the white cars looking for the letter N. While conducting this search, do the other cars capture your attention? Also, what if you're thinking about the blue shirt you just bought? Will your attention be captured by the color blue, like to this blue car? If your attention is captured, you might be slower to find your own white car, so there is a cost to this distraction. It turns out questions like this have been investigated using the additional singleton paradigm, which is often used to measure attentional capture. In this version of the task, participants have to report whether the diamond shape has an N or an M inside of it, and they're supposed to ignore the distracting circle stimuli, including this colored blue additional singleton. The additional singleton can capture visual attention. What does all of this have to do with the conference theme of visual working memory? Well, we can add a color memory test to investigate the role of visual working memory. This is similar to looking for your white car while thinking about your new blue shirt. Here on each trial, participants must remember a randomly presented color, and they have to report that color at the end of the trial. To investigate attentional capture, the additional singleton can be presented in a color that matches the contents of visual working memory, a color that does not match the contents of visual working memory, or no distractor, here indicated by a white circle. And what we see in a task like the additional singleton paradigm is that there is a cost when a colored additional singleton is present. This is known as a distractor cost, which can be seen on this graph as slower reaction times to colored items. Also, simply by having a color represented in visual working memory, participants respond more slowly on the search display when the color matches the memory color than when it is non-matching color. Thus, the distractor cost is enhanced simply by remembering a color in visual working memory. Does the previous work, using the additional singleton paradigm, inform our understanding of other kinds of attentional capture? Well, as it turns out, maybe it doesn't. Distractor costs are one way to measure attentional capture, but there are other ways. Bringing back this example from the beginning of the talk, I could say that you have finished your shopping and are looking for your blue car. Blue objects will jump out at you and capture your attention. But items that are not blue, even though they are equally as salient, like this red car, will not capture your attention. This phenomenon is referred to as an attentional control setting. To reiterate, observers can adopt an attentional control setting that guides the capture of visual spatial attention to only information that matches what the observer is searching for. When looking for blue, blue will capture attention, but red will not. We can use the Posner queuing task to assess for attentional control settings. Here, the participant has to report the orientation of the target line. Just before the target appears, a queue appears. If the queue and the target appear in the same location, also called the queued location, reaction times when responding to the target will be fast. If the queue captures attention but the target appears in the unqueued location, then reaction times will be slow. This difference in reaction times is called the queuing effect and indicates that the queue has captured attention. Importantly, the Posner queuing task has previously been used to assess attentional capture for attentional control settings. So, this leads us to our question. We know that we can use the Posner queuing task to assess attentional capture by attentional control settings, but as this is a visual working memory conference, we want to know whether visual working memory can be used to maintain an attentional control setting. How do we assess this? Well, let's start by adding a memory test to our Posner queuing task. This is our Experiment 1A version of the Posner queuing task. Participants must remember a color for later report at the end of the trial. Importantly, the memory item changes on each trial to encourage the use of visual working memory. Also, the colors on the memory probe screen are all quite similar, which encourages the use of visual working memory instead of verbal working memory. Before the memory test, participants have to report the orientation of the single line segment while ignoring the distracting queue. Experiment 1A uses typical Posner queuing timing as the queue appears before the target. Importantly, the target and the queue can appear at the same queued location or at different unqueued locations, and the cue can be in the color participants are holding in memory or a different color. Experiment 1B is exactly the same as Experiment 1A, except here we use typical additional singleton timing, where the cue appears at the same time as the target. So, we've already seen the expected pattern of results for the distractor cost, here shown on the left. Matching distractors should slow reaction times compared to non-matching distractors. But what about the cueing effect? What we should expect is that if participants can use visual working memory to maintain their attentional control setting, we should see a cueing effect when the cue matches the color they are trying to hold in memory. So if they are looking for blue and a blue cue appears, it should capture attention, leading to faster reaction times at the cued location and slower reaction times at the uncued location. However, I want to emphasize the prediction of the non-matching items in the Posner cueing task, as this is different than the non-matching stimuli in the additional singleton paradigm. An attentional control setting dictates what information will capture attention, but also which stimuli will not capture attention. If participants can use a visual working memory to maintain their attentional control setting, we should not see a cueing effect when the cue is a different color than the item in visual working memory. What do our actual results look like? The distractor cost results here replicated previous research. Matching distractors elicited longer reaction times than non-matching distractors. And when we used the typical additional singleton timing in Experiment 1B, both matching and non-matching cues produced longer reaction times than the no cue condition. This replicates previous research showing that merely remembering a color in visual working memory is sufficient for an enhancement of the distractor cost. But what about the cueing effect? Well, we saw a cueing effect both when the cue matched the color they were holding in memory and when the cue did not match what they were holding in memory. What this means is that the cue captured attention regardless of its color, meaning that simply remembering a color in visual working memory is not sufficient for participants to adopt an attentional control set for that color. While this distinction might not seem important, it's actually a pretty big deal. This is some preliminary evidence showing that the attentional capture elicited in the additional singleton paradigm might be different than the attentional capture elicited in the Posner cueing task. But we have to ask ourselves again, can visual working memory ever be used to maintain an attentional control setting? We know that there are other memory systems that are capable of maintaining attentional control settings, such as semantic memory and episodic long-term memory. But what about visual working memory? Well, let's go back to our definition of an attentional control setting. Humans can adopt attentional control settings based on their current attentional goals. When searching for blue, blue stimuli will capture attention, but red stimuli will not. However, in Experiment 1, we only had participants remember the color. So what if in Experiment 2, we instead have them search for that color? That's exactly what we did. Here, we have participants search for their target color at the end of the trial. The correct answer is actually this one here, because that matches the item that participants should have in visual working memory. Everything else about this task is essentially the same. We can present targets and cues at the same location or at different locations, and we can present the cue in the memory matching color or a memory non-matching color. What do we find when we have participants search for their target? Well, now we see attentional capture indicative of an attentional control setting for the search for visual working memory representation. Only matching blue cues produced a cueing effect. Non-matching red cues did not produce a cueing effect. This result demonstrates that observers can maintain an attentional control setting when they are searching for one target that is represented in visual working memory. But this still leaves us with an open question. Can visual working memory be used to maintain more than one attentional control setting that is capable of capturing visual spatial attention? We know, based on the dual state model, that only one active visual working memory representation can guide attention in the additional singleton paradigm. But what about attentional control settings in the Posner cueing task? This task should look pretty familiar by now, but we've changed it very slightly. On some trials, participants search for one memory color. On some trials, they search for two memory colors. The cue and the target can appear at the same location or at different locations, and now the cue can be presented in either of the two memory colors or a non-matching color. Here are our results. When searching for one target, we replicated our experiment 2 results. Participants adopted an attentional control setting, such that matching stimuli captured attention and produced a cueing effect, whereas non-matching stimuli did not capture attention and did not produce a cueing effect. But what happens when participants search for 2 targets? Here, no cues elicit cueing effects, regardless of whether they match one of the memory colors or not. This result is preliminary evidence demonstrating that observers are capable of maintaining one attentional control setting in visual working memory that is capable of capturing visual spatial attention, but they cannot maintain 2 attentional control settings in visual working memory. So, our first conclusion is that, while remembering a color using visual working memory is sufficient to produce a difference in reaction times for distractor costs, simply remembering a color using visual working memory is not sufficient for observers to adopt an attentional control setting for the memory color. Observers have to search for the color maintained in visual working memory in order for the color to form an attentional control setting. This tells us that, for attentional control settings, remembering is not the same as searching. Additionally, we have shown some preliminary evidence that visual working memory is capable of maintaining only one attentional control setting at a time, which parallels findings from the dual state model using the additional singleton paradigm. I'd like to thank my committee, everyone involved in this project, the Visual Cognitive Neuroscience Lab, and our funding sources. I'm happy to take any questions, and if you're interested in any of this work, it's available as a preprint, or you can email me at lplater@uofguelph.ca. Thank you.